In our last lesson, we talked about things to listen for when analyzing an orchestral piece by ear, looking at the minuet of Mozart's G minor symphony. Now I want to look at a longer piece, the slow movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I'll be using the score here, but my focus will still be on what an attentive listener would notice as the music progresses, rather than how the music fits or doesn't fit some standard form. This is very important, because a real composer has to develop their own personal sense of form. The well-known classical forms are based on broader general principles, which I've described in my book, Musical Composition, Craft and Art. But the composer often deviates from these standard forms in various degrees to better fit the character of the musical ideas. To take an obvious example, a melancholy, thoughtful, slow movement would not fit very well into a square, totally symmetrical ternary form. The composer might use some aspects of the ternary form, but they would be modified to fit the musical character. So the result would not be a simple ternary, but something else which wouldn't have a standard name. So let's look at this movement chronologically, just paying attention to salient aspects of the music as they arrive, and trying to understand the logic behind Beethoven's formal choices. In the first two bars, we hear the woodwind and then the strings in the background. The woodwind have an appoggiatura motive, outlining the dominant of B-flat major. The strings enrich the sound, playing in a lower register. The cello's chromatic neighbor note in measure 2, G-flat, colors the dominant harmony in a rather somber way. As the woodwind finished their little phrase, the strings begin a 4-bar melodic phrase, reaching a half cadence in measure 6. Then the woodwinds and the horns echo the cadence just heard in the strings. Then the strings enter the first phrase symmetrically, but this time finishing on an imperfect, authentic cadence in measure 11. This is once again echoed by the woodwinds and horns. We have a symmetrical period. Two phrases based on similar material where the first cadence is open-ended and the second one is somewhat more final. It's worth asking why Beethoven felt the need for that little introduction. Two reasons come to mind. First, it prepares the mood better than just plunging into the first phrase would have done. Second, the coming phrases are echoed by the clarinets and bassoons, so this little woodwind introduction begins the dialogue that will follow. When the third string phrase comes in measure 12, it presents a shorter phrase than the preceding ones, although still based on the same material. This again is echoed in the winds. This is as much novelty as we've had up to this point, but what follows is new. A little horn arpeggio brings in the strings again, but the repeated chord accompaniment motive that starts in measure 15 is also new. The first violins now go higher and reach the modest climax in measure 17 before cadencing in measure 18. Then the woodwind echo the cadence once more. Notice that the timpani enter here for the first time. Now the woodwinds go on to repeat the whole phrase, including the climax that we previously had in the strings, which now arrives in measure 22. And there's another difference. The lower winds have the repeated note accompaniment, and the strings now have a new arpeggio motive starting in measure 21. Let's listen up to here. Now we arrive at a pause of the dominant in measure 23. We expect a tonic resolution, but that isn't what happens. Instead, Beethoven uses the expected cadence as a turning point, leading off in a new direction. The surprise arrives on the fourth beat of the bar, which also adds a bit to the suspense. The E flat of the dominant 7 goes down to D, and the F goes up to F sharp. The voice leading makes it sound logical, but given the very diatonic nature of the preceding music, it still stands out. And when the new chord arrives, nothing changes in the harmony until bar 25. So Beethoven is keeping the listener in suspense all this time. This is a very salient turning point in the form, and for the listener, it's positively magical. This is a perfect example of how great composers play with our expectations. First, they create them over time, and then at a key moment, they give us a surprise that's much better than what we expected. Notice that the flutes and oboes have never played in this first theme. The new section turns out to be in D major, and it is a new theme presented first in the second violins and violas in unison. The bass is a pedal point on A, activated a bit by what amount to large neighbor notes in the basses and first bassoon. Note the subtle touches of woodwind color in bassoon 1 and clarinet 1 in measure 26 and 27. They harmonize the melody momentarily in the middle parts. When the phrase restarts in measure 29, those little additions are richer with the addition of the previously silent oboe and flute, and the register expands. Also, starting at the end of measure 30, the oboe and first bassoon double the melody in octaves above and below, respectively. This gives the repeated melodic phrase a sense of progression. Note how bassoon 2 enriches the 16th note descent in the second half of measure 31, and then how the clarinets reinforce the cadence in measure 32. Then the melody starts again in measure 33, still in violin 2 and viola, and still doubled by the oboe an octave higher. There's also a new counterpoint in the first violins in the same register as the oboe. The bass line is the same as before, but orchestrated differently. Now the cellos have repeated syncopated notes on the pedal A, and the basses are pizzicato. Those syncopated notes make the accompaniment a bit more restless. As the phrase progresses in measure 35-40, and then repeating once more in 37-40, the upper woodwinds exchange the doubling of the melody between oboe and flute, the latter an octave higher. The counterpoint in violin 1 continues. Finally, at the cadence, flute and oboe play together in measure 39 and 40. The cadence in measure 41 is once again a surprise, another salient turning point in the form. These turning points announce to the listener that something important is about to happen. The cadence here turns out to be a deceptive cadence, but in D minor, not D major. The resulting B-flat chord will take us back to the home key. Given the fact that the second theme has been 100% diatonic in D major, this really stands out. Now the horns enter for the first time in this section, as the harmony changes to the dominant of B-flat major. In measure 42, the violin 16th notes over the dominant 7 to B-flat seem to suggest a new momentum. So this section is constructed quite differently from the first theme. Harmonically, it's built over a pedal point. The melody repeats four times, with the orchestration gradually growing upwards and getting richer. Let's listen to this. The second turning point in measure 41-42 has led us back to B-flat major. As we listen to the new section, it starts to sound familiar. The musical surface isn't identical with the first section, but the cadences arrive at the same times, and the woodwinds echo them as they did before. Gradually, we realize that this is actually a variation of the first theme. The melody, which was previously in the strings, is now an ornamented version of what it was the first time. But the orchestration here is different. During the string melody, the woodwinds and violas have sustained harmony, and the horns, the second violins, and the cellos have a new rhythmic motive as accompaniment. The woodwind answering echoes are pretty much the same as they were before. When the fourth phrase arrives in measure 60, the accompaniment changes, as it did before. Notice those familiar little arpeggios in the violins and viola. As before, the melody is now in the first clarinet. And, as in the first section, flutes and oboes don't play at all here. Measure 63 seems to be once again suggesting the same turning point we heard in measure 23, but this time it will go in a different direction. Let's listen to this section. We'll continue looking at this movement in our next lesson. You may note that I have not named the overall form as yet. This is because, for the listener, form is not a jello mold just to be filled in the same way each time, but rather an ongoing experience. And any serious analysis has to take account of the listener's experience as they listen. We'll have more to say about this later on.